Welcome back. For this flat irons tuning tech tip, we're going to take a look at suspension. And basically, we're about to throw these Feal 441 coilovers on our BMW 335i project car. And we realized we want to have just a quick discussion on the two different types of coilovers that you're going to see if you're trying to pick a suspension for your car. Basically, there's coilovers that have a fixed perch, where the strut and the bracket that mounts to your steering knuckle is all welded together and it's all one piece. And then there's some coilovers that have an independent height adjustment, like these 441s here, that give you a different way to adjust ride height. So we kind of want to take a look at both systems, see what some of the differences are, and give you a little bit more information so that if you're trying to pick one for your car, you've got a little bit more to go on to make sure you get the right one. Before we dive into that, just real quick, want to say that if you like this channel, if you like the content that we put out, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us out a lot. And if you want us to keep coming back and making content, the very best thing you can do to support this channel is head over to our website, which is flatironstuning.com, and just take a look around. If we've got anything at all that you might need, if we could earn your business at all, that goes a long way to letting us come back here and make more content for you. So please like and subscribe to the channel, and head over to Flat Irons Tuning and give it a look. So yeah, back to the coilover. So there's going to be those two different styles, the fixed perch and the independent height adjustment. I'm going to call those double adjustable coilovers, just because you have two different ways you can adjust ride height. So let's just look at the two different styles first off. So if you've got a strut that's a fixed perch, basically your strut body is going to be welded into this bracket, or this bracket's connected to the strut itself that connects to your steering knuckle. And if you want to change the height on the car, you can do that by moving this nut up or down to move basically the spring up or down. And that's the tool that you have to adjust ride height. Now, with something like this, which is a double adjustable coilover, the strut body itself is threaded, and it threads into this bracket that connects to your steering knuckle. So if you want to move the car up, you can actually spin the whole strut assembly and move the car up. And if you want to lower the car, you can spin the whole strut assembly more into this bracket and drop the car down to get your ride height set. So before we talk about what's actually going on in the strut when you're doing that, there's two different kinds of travel that you want to pay attention to, or that you're adjusting, which is your compression travel and your droop travel. So compression travel is the easy one to visualize, because that's basically you're compressing the piston. Droop travel is a little bit harder to visualize, but I brought this little toy in here, which it's basically just a plunger, but it's a really good visual to see what's going on when you're changing ride height, especially on the fixed perch struts. So if this is your strut and we've got the piston right here, compression travel again is basically compressing the strut, basically moving the piston to the top of its travel. Now, droop travel, the best way to visualize that is if you put a jack underneath your car, the car's flat, and you start raising it up, the body of the car is going to start rising up, but the tire is still going to be in contact with the ground. So for some distance, the tire is still going to be in contact with the ground as you're raising your car. And then finally, once you've maxed out your droop travel, then the tire comes off the ground. So basically, the droop travel is how much you can extend the tire and still keep it in contact with the ground right before it comes off. And the total travel of the strut is going to be a combination of those two, of the compression and the droop travel. So with the fixed perch coilover, the thing to keep in mind is that as you're changing the ride height, you're basically making a compromise with the travel of the strut. So here we've got the strut probably about 1.5 inches up. In talking to the guys from Feal, ideally you want to have about 30% of your suspension travel for droop travel, and then the remainder for compression travel. So for about 1.5 inches up here, this is 5.5 inches, because that's the standard suspension stroke for a Subaru coilover. And so you've got about 4 inches up and 1.5 inches down. So if we wanted to raise the car 1/2 inch, what we're going to do is we're actually going to spin that spring seat up, move the spring up, and we're going to extend the piston of the strut. And so basically the piston of the strut goes 1/2 inch closer to the bottom of its travel, and that's where we get the ride height gain. So we're compromising our droop travel to get ride height. If we wanted to lower the car, we're going to move the piston another 1/2 inch, say, up towards the top of its travel, going to drop the car down, and we're compromising compression travel to get that lowered ride height. So knowing or keeping that in mind when you're adjusting a fixed perch coilover is really important. That same thing can happen with a double adjustable coilover, but it's typically, if you're just changing ride height, you would only be moving basically the strut body up and down and not touching the travel of the strut. So though it can happen, it's usually if you are using the two forms of adjustment against each other that you would end up at one of those extremes or the other. So with kind of having a picture of what's happening as you're changing the ride height, especially with that fixed perch strut, it is worth mentioning that there are two extremes on that scale that can cause some issues. So the first one of those, and the harder one maybe to visualize, is if you basically have a standard ride height where the piston is fully extended. So basically you have no droop travel. Now the way to visualize what that would mean is that if the car's on the ground and you put a jack underneath the car and you give it even one or two pumps to lift the car, the tire's going to immediately come off the ground because your piston doesn't have any more travel to go. It's already fully extended, so as soon as you start to raise the car up, the tire's coming off the ground. Now, why that's a problem, or can be a problem, is if you're driving at the track and you're going around a hard corner where there's a lot of weight transfer to the outside. If the suspension doesn't have any ability to extend to keep that tire in the ground, it can be very easy to lift that inside tire off the ground, and then you lose traction. So obviously, and then losing traction, that can be a problem. Now, the other end of that spectrum is if you have the stroke of the piston set so that it is basically right at or close to the top of its travel, so you don't have any compression travel. So in that case, the best way to visualize where that could be an issue is if you're driving around the track and say you hit one of the curbs on the inside of the corner. If you've taken the suspension's ability to absorb that impact away, then as soon as you hit that curb, you're basically going to be right on the bump stop. So it's really going to upset the car, and it's also going to be a much harsher ride because basically you're just not letting the suspension absorb, or you've taken the suspension's ability to absorb any kind of little impact like that away, and then that unsettles the car. So those are the two extremes that you definitely want to avoid. And again, it is possible with the double adjustable coilovers to get into that scenario, but it's much more rare. It's much more common with the fixed perch struts, depending on how you set them up. So it's definitely something to be aware of. Okay, so let's talk about some features and benefits for each style. Let's start with the double adjustable or the independent height adjustable coilovers. So obviously, any suspension manufacturer is going to give you a range of height adjustment, and because you can adjust the height without tinkering with the suspension travel, typically these double adjustable coilovers are going to have a broader range of ride height adjustment, so that could definitely be an advantage. Something else that's come about with manufacturers like Teen and Cusco is they realize, well, if you ever have to rebuild these struts, but it's so modular that because the strut body is threaded into this bracket, what they can do is instead of you having to send this whole thing back to have it rebuilt, you can actually just disassemble it and just order new struts. They'll send you just the new struts by themselves. You just put the top hat, the springs back on, thread it back into this bracket, and you've basically put in a brand new strut without having the downtime of having to send the suspension out and wait for it to come back. So that's definitely a nice benefit. Also with these double adjustables, these once you get into kind of the mid-tier and mid-upper tier, a lot of them are going to be these independent ride height adjustable struts. It's fairly easy to make them give you compression and rebound adjustment. So there's a lot of features that come with this. There's one drawback that's worth mentioning. It depends on the application. It depends on how much room the strut has to work and the shape of the bracket that the strut body is threading into. But one of the potential drawbacks of having that independent height adjustment is you can actually end up having a little bit less overall suspension travel because you have to shrink the strut body itself to give you enough room to thread it into this bracket to give you the ride height adjustment that you want. Perfect example of that is the rear strut here for this BMW. This is the rear strut, and it basically connects on both ends to the car and then to the lower control arm. But this strut body has to thread into this cup that has basically a sealed bottom. So it can only go so far into this cup before it bottoms out, and that's all the adjustment that you have. So if you want to have a certain amount of ability to lower the car, to a certain extent, you have to shorten that strut travel to give yourself that right height adjustment. So in certain cases with these double adjustable coilovers, that is one drawback to them. So let's take a look at the fixed perch struts. So there's definitely an advantage of having less moving pieces with those. Because the strut body and the bracket that attaches to the steering knuckle is all one piece, it's all welded together. Less moving parts, there's no threads that could get stuck from road grime and dirt and that sort of thing. That can definitely be an advantage. Again, with those fixed perch struts, you want to pay really close attention to the designed ride height that they're basically built around. Most of these manufacturers are going to have some kind of a 1-inch drop from stock. That's everything that they're built around. And as we discussed, there's definitely some trade-offs to going even a little bit above or below that targeted ride height with those fixed perch struts especially. So you want to try and make sure that the coilovers that you get are going to, especially if they're a fixed perch, are built around your targeted ride height. If you'll notice that a lot of the higher end coilovers, like the ASTs, the Motons, Ohlins, the KWs that are on a Pikes Peak car here, for instance, those are all fixed perch struts. And part of the reason for that is once you get to a more motorsports coilover, having a little bit less moving pieces, there can be some advantages to that. And the advantage that they have is that because basically they're welding that bracket onto the strut body, they know where the strut body is going to be placed, they can always use as much stroke in the strut as possible because they've kind of locked you into a certain range of adjustment. So in the right circumstance, that can absolutely be an advantage. But again, you have to pay attention to that ride height that they're set for. Perfect example are Scotty's coilovers, his AST 51 or 5200s that are on his STI. He was running those, or he's got those on his car and set up for pretty much the low end of their designed ride height. And what we ran into is that scenario where he basically had very minimal, if any, suspension travel or compression travel. He only had about 1/2 inch of compression travel initially. Now, in the case of the ASTs, they were aware enough of that potential issue that they actually came out with a new top hat. So on those coilovers, AST's top hats actually have an extra inch of suspension travel built into them. So when you put those on, they basically come up an extra inch up over the top of the top hat and give you an extra inch of travel there. So that helped out the fronts. And then in the rears, we put on the Voodoo 13 lower control arms that also had an extra inch of travel from their design. And so that got the rears working the way that we needed to. And that's how we were able to get his car sorted out. But because it was a fixed perch strut and it was on, he was wanting to run it on the very low end of its designed ride height, we had to go to some extra steps to really get it to work properly. So those are pretty much the pluses and the minuses of those two different setups. So hopefully that gives you some good information to go on, so that you've got a better idea to pick the right suspension for you. So hopefully it works right for you right out of the gate. So again, if you like this content, if you like the stuff that we're doing with the channel, please drop a like and subscribe. That helps us out a ton. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.